Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 316. Now, as some of you know, my research time has been a little bit truncated in the last week or so, but I've decided to flip that on its head and use that as an opportunity to do a video I've been wanting to do for some time, which is largely driven by my current collecting focus, and it's records that are, well, frankly, the oldest records I have in my collection, anything from 1955 or before in terms of release date. So in that category, I have a little more than 24 records, and I've done my best to order them not just by reverse order, that is to say from newest to oldest, but also when they're all released on the same label to do so in reverse catalog order. So it truly is newest to oldest as we go through. It's almost all jazz with a little bit of Latin sprinkled in here and there. And interestingly enough, other than the first 3 or 4 records, which are East Coast releases, it's almost all West Coast jazz, which is probably a function of the fact that if you're trying to buy hard bop records from the 1950s and original pressings, you're talking Blue Note and Prestige and Riverside, and you're talking silly money for those releases. But West Coast jazz, for whatever reason, snobbery or what have you, still goes for reasonable prices, and so that's where a lot of my collecting has been focused. The music is great in these records, but the other hidden or not so hidden secret about those great contemporary and Pacific jazz releases is that the production was fantastic as well. So the first record I want to talk about, starting in 1955, is this one by Johnny Smith, the Johnny Smith Quartet, by his quartet. There's a lot of kind of unimaginative album titles in this list. And Smith, of course, is a guitarist that will be best known to viewers as the guy who collaborated with Stan Getz on a single called Moonlight in Vermont in 1952, which then gets, I think, released as an album in 1956. He was pretty active as a performer in the 1950s, kind of dormant thereafter, but there are a number of records that he puts out. This one's on Roost, which is interesting, which is a label kind of more commonly associated with the 1940s boppers, and a very kind of abstract and modern cover as well, given that. It's as good as anything he put out in the 1950s, which was all pretty good, and you can probably begin and end with his output with this particular release, but it's still pretty good. Next we have this record, Sarah Vaughan in Hi-Fi. Now, a lot of these records come from the time when the 10-inch record was being phased out in the early 50s, and the LP, the full 12-inch record, was coming in around 53, 54, 55. And so what would happen is you often had releases or re-releases of records that had previously come out on 10-inch formats and with a few extra tracks added. And this is exactly what you have with Sarah Vaughan in Hi-Fi. It's basically a 1950 10-inch release called Sarah Vaughan with 4 additional tracks culled from her enormous list of singles that she was putting out at the time on Columbia. I've been accused on this channel of ignoring vocal jazz, which is probably a fair criticism and actually one that I'm going to try and rectify in the near future. But I've always been a Sarah Vaughan fan, and she is absolutely fantastic here. All this basically is wall-to-wall, incredible performances of well-known jazz standards like Nice Work If You Can Get It and things of that ilk. The next record, also from 1955, is on Columbia. It's a compilation by the great guitarist Charlie Christian. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're Bonnie Raitt or Jimmy Page or Pat Metheny or Jeff Beck or Tal Farlow or whomever. If you play electric guitar in the late part of the 20th century, you find your lineage and your musical roots will trace back to Charlie Christian, who's only really active from 1936 to 1942. Principally with Benny Goodman, but he's the guy who basically invents the vocabulary of electric guitar soloing. And what you have on here is him playing with Benny Goodman's sextet, and it's mostly bluesy numbers. You've got to put up with a little bit of Benny's clarinet. Sorry, Benny fans, actually, just kidding. I don't mind Benny's clarinet. But what you really get in the heart of these tracks is incredible solo work and improvisation by Charlie Christian, who, it doesn't matter whether you're reading Barney Kessel's biography or anyone's really from the 40s and 50s, they all say, you know, this guy was the major influence, and surely he was. So a great compilation, a great place to start with Christian. Now, we have a couple of other records still in 1955 from Cal Tjader. Now, one is by his Mambo Quintet. I'm going to have to blur this record cover out, I'm sure, in this video so I don't get gonged by YouTube for having nipples on screen. And also, so this one's called Ritmo Caliente by his Mambo Quintet, and then Mambo with Tjader shortly thereafter by his modern Mambo Quintet. and I think they are largely the same artist. But what was interesting about Jader, he of course came to prominence early in the whole Brubeck-Desmond flurry of activity in San Francisco. He'd met Brubeck at college. He was part of Brubeck's original octet. He was then part of a trio with Brubeck. Then they go their separate ways, and he becomes somebody who in the 1950s is focused both on straight-ahead jazz, but increasingly on Latin jazz. And he is arguably the only major contributor to Latin jazz in the whole genre who is not a Latino himself, but is considered credible by all the other players. This is pretty early in that, but these are both really solid records, both of these. For instance, all of the players he's got, all of the percussion players he's got are experienced Latin percussion players, so this is pretty much the real McCoy. And now we turn to Gerry Mulligan for the first time, and this rather, I don't know, I don't think Discogs has a term for exactly what's happening to the lamination here, but it's like it's almost carbonated or something. Anyway, this is presenting the Gerry Mulligan Sextet. So this is actually Gerry, mid-50s Gerry, after he's had his original great quartet, which I'll talk about in a little while, and he's now splitting his time between the East Coast and the West Coast. But pretty much anything that he did in the 1950s is worth listening to. There are some pretty well-known West Coast players on here as well. You can see there's let's focus. There's Gerry with Zoot Sims, and there is Bob Brookmeyer playing the valve trombone and so on. Anyway, great record, well worth picking up. And still in 1955, Shorty Rogers and his Giants, get it, because Shorty was not very tall, the Swinging Mr. Rogers, which sounds a little bit like a polyamory club for children's entertainers, but we'll just set that aside. This is a pretty darn good record by Rogers. Again, he produces a lot of good music in the 1950s, pretty much all in that West Coast cool kind of subgenre. He tended to work with larger ensembles. I think he's probably got, well, I was actually going to say with slightly larger ensembles like octets, but this one, of course, is just a sextet and a whole bunch of basically all-star West Coast names on here, like people like Jimmy Giuffre on reeds, Pete Jolly on keys, Curtis Counts is on bass, Shelly Mann's on drums, all West Coast legends. So that's a keeper, as is the next one, which is actually an absolutely brilliant record, which is Hampton Hawes' debut on contemporary, the Hampton Hawes Trio. Great, great cover, even better music inside. It's just a terrific outing. Red Mitchell's on bass, Chuck Thompson is on drums, and this is the record which actually makes Charlie Haydn leave his country and western family home in the Great Plains and move out to California in search of Hampton Hawes. It swings pretty much start to finish, and I think, however, there's one really lovely unaccompanied piece by Hawes on here as well. So now we move to the newest and most recent of the 10-inch records I have. There's a lot more 10 inches in this list, and this is Shelly Mann's record, one of his early records on contemporary. Anything released on contemporary around this time, particularly first or early pressings, sounds just like butter. So good. Les Koenig production, Roy Dunan engineering, and just something about those old deep grooves sounds fantastic, and no exception here. Again, this is one of his earliest records, and it's got a rather unusual lineup because, as you can see, it's got Shelly Mann on drums, Jimmy Giuffre on reeds, and Shorty Rogers on trumpet. No bass, just like the Doors, but it sounds pretty good for all that. You can get this compiled on, I think, a full 12-inch LP called The 2 and the 3. But again, there's something about having those very early pressings on contemporary that just rewards your ears enormously. Now, next I have something which is a source of great disappointment for me, but I've recently solved it, which is a copy of the Jack Montrose Sextet. As you can see, lacking a proper cover, the record is in there from 1955. This is one of the relatively few records put out by Montrose, who was principally an arranger. He did a lot of work with Clifford Brown. And the actual cover of this record is from Pacific Jazz's West Coast Artist Series, which are so beautiful that I've actually broken down and gone and ordered a copy just so I could have an early pressing with that wonderful cover art. There are some well-known West Coast names on here, some lesser-known names, but the more dominant impression from this record is of these moments of compositional flair that you might expect when you've got a band leader who is basically an arranger first and a band leader second. The next two records are albums which immediately precede this record in the West Coast Artists series on Pacific Jazz, and you'll see what I mean about these covers. So this one is the Gerry Mulligan Quartet featuring Chet Baker. This is actually a compilation. It's drawn from 3 different 10 inches on Pacific Jazz, a couple of which I'm actually going to discuss in a little bit, so I won't linger too much on those. But basically, it's a compilation from the first, second, and fifth releases on Pacific Jazz. Even if you have all of those 10-inch records, and I don't normally gather compilations, I'm going to make an exception for this particular series because the art on these is just breathtaking and totally of the moment, just captures that particular moment in time and art. And what you have here are all the key players from that early Mulligan-Baker quartet, with obviously Mulligan and Baker, Larry Bunker on drums, along with Chico Hamilton, the original drummer, and Carson Smith and Bob Whitlock sharing bass duties. Anyway, this one is a real keeper in many different ways. The next record immediately precedes this, the Pacific Jazz lineup, and this is Chet Baker, and it's an album called The Trumpet Artistry of Chet Baker, but just like the previous one, it's actually a compilation drawn from earlier 10 inches. I can't quite figure out the full provenance of this one, but it's all from Pacific Jazz releases from 1952, 53, and 54. There are a whole bunch of different sidemen on here, but the one real constant other than Baker is the piano player Russ Freeman, whose contribution to Baker's playing in the 1950s really can't be overstated. Just fantastic. And once again, that great cover art. And now we turn to another very 1950s thing, which was the half and half jazz album. So this one has Bud Shank on tenor and actually a whole bunch of different reeds and flutes on side A, with Shorty Rogers on flugelhorn next to him. And then on the back side, you've got Bud Shank again with Bill Perkins, another multi-instrumental reed player, alongside, and Hampton Hawes on piano and Red Mitchell on bass, a few other kind of lesser known players here. Anyway, this is a tremendous outing, pretty much start to finish, and really, again, kind of a one-off in terms of an album cover as well, because you did get these 50-50 kinds of releases, but they tended not to have this kind of reversible cover, which is kind of neat. We're still in 1955, incidentally, and now let's turn to this one, which is the last 1955 record I have, or maybe the earliest 1955 record I have, which is Gerry Mulligan, California Concerts. Now, Gerry had a tough time in 1953. Well, it started off great because he had this great quartet with Chet Baker, but in June 53 he gets busted and he goes away for 6 months to jail. And in that time, his quartet splits apart. Baker starts playing with other people, gets his own group, and when Gerry comes out, Baker doesn't really want to form up again, so Gerry has to kind of remake his own universe, as he'd had to do about 18 months before. So this is Gerry gigging actually at a couple of high schools in California in later on in 1953. No, must be early 1954, I guess. These recordings. No, it's late 1954. But anyway, so he's got his act together. He's got a new group of players. Some of his old friends are sitting in here. So Chico Hamilton is sitting in. Chet Baker was also supposed to play in some of these gigs, but ironically, he was in the can on a heroin bust when these were being recorded. Anyway, excellent music, like pretty much anything Gerry touches in the 1950s, just fantastic. And that's, again, a real collector's item and a keeper. Now, 1954, a British pressing, kind of dog-eared and well-loved, of Shorty Rogers and his Giants on his master's voice. I think this may originally have come out on, I'm not sure actually, maybe Fantasy. Anyway, I've got to research that. So this is one of his earliest releases, and again, it's really evident how incestuous this little small world of West Coast jazz was, because, surprise, surprise, Shelly Mann's on drums. Shelly Mann's drumming on about half these records here and there. Joe Mondragon, another well-known name, on bass. Hampton Hawes, again, on piano. And Jimmy Giuffre on tenor sax, plus a few other folks. This is one of those records where Rogers is performing in kind of what I think is his preferred oeuvre, which was an octet or something like that, which isn't always to my taste, but he always swung Shorty, and he, I guess, as much as anybody, defines a West Coast sound. So, a good one. I might like a better version of that cover, but there you have it. Now, 1954, we have a West Coast artist playing on the East Coast, and this is Dave Brubeck and an early version of his quartet playing over 3 separate nights at different times at the club in Boston called Storyville, which was owned by George Wine, or Ween, I'm not sure how he pronounced his name, but the guy who was behind the Newport Jazz Fest. And as I say, it's an early version of the quartet because Ron Crotty, who was the original bassist, is on here. And then on some other tracks, Bob Bates has taken over. Of course, he'd eventually be replaced by Eugene Wright in the classic lineup. This is a pretty good record. It's kind of let down. It's a live recording, of course, and it's kind of let down by the recording quality, but it's not so bad that you can't enjoy it. And certainly it's a very interesting early listen to what was, of course, one of jazz's classic groups. It also has a really cool cover, kind of a faux newspaper kind of thing. Again, not orally that superb, but definitely worth a listen. Now we come to a real mystery, and this is a record that Discogs knows almost nothing about, that Wikipedia knows nothing about, and these are some artists that basically are unknown except for the fact that they were on this record, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions. And this is the Bob Tully Quintet, and it has, amongst other things, some of the most breathless liner notes that you're ever gonna come across. It starts off. The first word is zounds. Zounds, what sounds, man? Novel, distinctive, ear-fetching. Anyway, lots of. It's almost like it was written by Trump. He uses a lot of, all caps kinds of stuff in there. Anyway, it's Bob Tully, who doesn't make much of a dent otherwise, except on this record, on trumpet, Nash Mays on tenor sax, and the only people that are really of note here, well, particularly, there's a guy called Willie Maiden, who did a lot of arranging for Maynard Ferguson, who does some of the arrangements here. And there's also a guy called Paul Binnings, who used to play bass with Count Basie at certain points. But otherwise, all the other players on here, there are several of them, are only known for being on this record and little else. And you can find nothing else about this record. As for the music itself, it's 1950s cool jazz, West Coast sound. It's very much of its time. The soloists aren't necessarily anything to write home about, but it's still pretty good. But now to ratchet up the quality of what we're talking about, here's another 10-inch from 1954, Lenny Niehause's record, the Volume 1, the Quintet. Now, Lenny Niehaus is a guy who was best known as a sideman for Stan Kenton throughout the 1950s, and that's actually true of so many of these West Coast players. They were all, one way or another, refugees or alumni, whatever, of Stan Kenton. And he also, Niehaus, did some arrangements for Clint Eastwood movies later on. But he did put out 5 records for contemporary in the 1950s, and they are all excellent, and none of them are any better than this one, which swings all the way through super hard, and again, just has that fantastic contemporary sound from that particular time, just in terms of the quality of the recording. Highly, highly recommended. As is this next record, same vein, another 10-inch on contemporary, and this is Barney Kessel's first release on that particular label. A lot of people might name different guitarists if asked to name the best guitarist of the 1950s. In fact, most people might name different guitarists, but there is a pretty solid lobby, increasingly so, as far as I can tell, for Barney Kessel in that regard, and he sounds just terrific here. This is one of the most seductive sounding records I've ever heard. Again, that great contemporary sound, and some wonderful selections, wonderful arrangements. And he's backed up here again by by some of the West Coast Mafia, people like Bud Shank and Shelly Manne, again, of course, are on here. Terrific, terrific record. Now, we move on to the Red Norvo Trio. Now, this is the original Red Norvo Trio. This is now 1953. This is a French release, again, a 10-inch, obviously. And this is the version of the Red Norvo Trio, the original one, which had Tal Farlow on guitar and Charles Mingus on bass, rescued from being a postal worker by Red Norvo. And this is from kind of around the time when they were playing at The Hague in late 51, early 52, when Mulligan and Baker were also hanging out there and were about to form their famous quartet. And it's just before the infamous incident when the Norvo Trio was to play on TV, and they were informed that because they were an integrated group, because they had 2 white players and 1 black player, that they weren't going to be allowed to be on TV, or at least this was basically made subtly plain to them. And according to Mingus, Norvo just failed to stick up for his bass player, and that was how Mingus ended up leaving the group. I guess if his version is accurate, very understandably so. So pretty good music if you dig the vibes. I personally find it more interesting to listen to as an early example of Mingus's playing. But if you're a vibes fan, then double your pleasure. Now, 1953 still. Here we have the third ever release on Pacific Jazz, which is Chet Baker's solo release. Again, it's the summer of '53. The pianoless quartet of Gerry Mulligan has come and gone thanks to Mulligan's drug bust, but Baker is in his absolute prime here. He's hooked up, too, for the first time with the piano player Russ Freeman, and I mentioned him before, who just really is his sideman par excellence through the rest of the decade or through many different releases. And also you have on here some of the alumni of the earlier Mulligan-Baker quartet, people like Bobby Whitlock, Larry Bunker, Carson Smith, and also there's a guy called Bobby White who plays some drums here as well. Just tremendous record. Baker never better than on these records this particular time in his life. And now moving from the third release on Pacific Jazz to the second ever release on Pacific Jazz. Again, kind of a cool double-sided cover. This is the original Gerry Mulligan quartet with Baker, although they switched out Bob Whitlock for Carson Smith on bass because Bob Whitlock couldn't travel. But here they also have Lee Konitz, the famous alto sax player, and like Mulligan, a veteran of the Birth of the Cool sessions with Miles Davis and Gil Evans in 49 and 50 and 51 in New York, who is sitting in with the quartet, making it a quintet. So again, this is just an excellent record. I mean, it's a fantastic quartet anyway, with Mulligan and Baker, and then when you add a third, basically all-star horn, Konitz, results speak for themselves. And of course, having talked about the third and second ever releases on Pacific Jazz, here is the first ever release on Pacific Jazz, which is the original Baker and Mulligan quartet. There they are. There's Chico, there's Gerry, there's Bob Whitlock, and there upside down is Chet Baker. I talked about this record the other day on the channel, and it's just excellent. It's also, in addition to being glorious music, a really serendipitous thing, because what it does is help to birth one of the great labels in jazz, which is Pacific Jazz. Now, just to deviate from cool jazz for a second, we have a slight deviation to Latin jazz, and this one, actually just like the Gerry Mulligan one just now, was from 1952. This is a record which cropped up in a bit of a Latin music sort of exploration and research and collecting jag I was on a couple of years ago. And I was really interested. It actually started because I thought to myself, I love the soundtrack to or the theme song to the series Narcos. And I didn't know what kind of music it was, so I researched that and I found out it was a bolero. And I thought, well, geez, I really dig boleros. Let me find more examples of boleros. And so some of the records I'm going to talk about now are a consequence of that bolero search. And this is a very early, certainly a post-war release by a Mexican singer, one of the great giants of Mexican music in the middle part of the 20th century, a guy called Agustin Lara. And this is his record, Invitación al Romance, or Invitation to Love. And here is Agustin on the back, and he appears to be holding some kind of porcelain dog. Maybe it's a real dog, but I think not. I think it's a porcelain dog. It's maybe what the prize that you get in Mexico for being one of the great bolero singers. Anyway, this is a terrific record. It's just classy, classy, classy all the way through. And now we move to 1951, and this is Volume 1 of the Red Norvo Trio, again, recorded in 1951, as I think was that 1953 release as well. It's all from that time, because I think, well, I'm not quite sure exactly when Mingus split, but this is from that time, basically when they were hanging out at The Hague and recording in LA. More of the same. And there's actually quite a nice photograph of the group on the back there. You can see Mingus looking like he kind of knows what's coming in the back there. And you can actually get both Volume 1 and Volume 2 on a compilation by Savoy, which comes out in 1956, called Move, which has one of the great covers I've ever seen on any record, and is probably collectible just for that very reason. Now, we now have the two oldest records that are in my collection. One of them, the first one I'm going to show you, is from 1951, and the second one is from 1949, both 10-inch records, obviously. And they're both by the same group, Trio Los Panchos. Now, Trio Los Panchos were started in 1944. They were Mexicans living in New York, and they formed a kind of group which is very popular in Mexico, a trio romantico, which kind of is what it sounds. Basically, three guys playing Mexican guitars and harmonizing. And there's a very distinctive sound to that, which I love, and I'm sure you would recognize. And these guys are probably the greatest exponents of this style of bolero singing, this trio romantico format in the middle part of the 20th century. Now, that's a group which, like a lot of 70s rock bands, has continued to evolve its membership. So they're still going, apparently, or at least they were around 2015. But of course, none of the original members are still alive, let alone in the group. So this is volume 2, which comes out in 1951. Boleros selectos por trio Los Panchos. So boleros selected, not just any old boleros, but boleros which are selected for trio Los Panchos to sing. Just wonderful, wonderful music. It's not just the quality of the recording, which is incredible for the time. It's not just the songs themselves. It's the harmonization, which I find is just, frankly, just transporting. I just totally dig this stuff. And this is absolutely wonderful. And it is only surpassed, I think, by this record, its predecessor. Again, Boleros Selectos por Trio Los Panchos. So again, not just any old boleros. And I think, too, for 1949, a very cool cover, a very modern looking cover for that particular point in time. So anyway, highly, highly recommended. And if you are even slightly partial to Latin music, I suggest digging into some of the older performances of people who specialized in boleros, because it's very, very rewarding. So that is that. So if these records made you think of other releases, early releases, jazz records or otherwise, which you're very fond of and you want the world to know about, please do let me know in the comments. I really hope you enjoyed this. I do appreciate everybody indulging me, not doing my usual shtick, but talking about something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is especially those early cool jazz recordings. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.